All right, why don't we go ahead and we'll get started here in just a second. So we're doing this because a number of folks in Urbandale were interested in really learning about how we potentially could start a sustainability committee or do some work to address climate, create a climate action team, or do some work with the city, elected officials in the city to really help drive some of the sustainability goals for the city, climate and sustainability goals. So one of the first things folks wanted to do was learn more. There's been a few different speaker series that have happened in Urbandale over the last couple months that have been really informative. And I'm going to turn it over to Pat to introduce Jonathan, who is going to be our guest today. And then we'll go ahead and let Jonathan get started.
Yeah, I just had a couple of words to say on behalf of Jonathan Rosenbloom. He's really just done some amazing work, both with his students when he was here at university, and now he's not with us, but we hope someday we'll get him back. He was professor of environmental law at Drake, and I assume you're in a similar position there, Jonathan, out in, is it Maine or Vermont? It's the great Northeast. Vermont, I thought so. And back when he was here at Drake, and I was still working at RDG, I kind of had the privilege to partner with Jonathan some on, we had some of his students at our office, and they were working with Jonathan on developing this ridiculously robust and meaningful website that communities and other organizations can use, including all kinds of basic fundamental information. We'll see opportunities, I think, to see model ordinances, just a whole slew of resources. And so when we were starting this effort, we were recognizing that some of us know something about one thing, not the other. And knowing of this resource and its breadth and depth, it seemed logical to ask Jonathan if he would be generous enough to help us understand how to use it. And he's a really busy guy, and I can't imagine in these times that he's any less busy, but he has generously agreed to walk us through a couple of the chapters of this website so that we'll have this tool at the ready for us. And Jonathan, I'm going to turn it over to you with a great deal of gratitude.
Well, thank you, Pat, and thanks, Carrie and Linda, for setting this up, and thank you all for taking the time. And as Pat said, it is an incredibly unique and busy time for us all, and so I appreciate you taking the time to go through this and to hear out the Sustainable Development Code. I'm going to try to share my screen. If you can't hear me or can't see the screen, please let me know. Hopefully it is coming through now. Yep. Great. All right, so what I thought I'd do tonight is start by just talking about the Sustainable Development Code, what it is and how to use it, and then go into two of the subchapters, and I'll talk about what the other subchapters are, but the two subchapters are green infrastructure that we'll look at and climate change mitigation. Now I'm going to throw a ton of information at you, both in terms of how to use the code and what's in the subchapters. But I would suggest that you try not to get overwhelmed in the sense that, again, there's a lot of stuff happening out there. But the big thing, I think, for us here tonight is to see that there's some stuff that we can access. And then the next question is, okay, well, how does that match up with what we're looking for in Urbandale? And then what is sort of the priorities? What do we want to set as our priorities moving forward? And then you kind of figure it out from there. So again, I just give just a word of caution because there is a lot of information here, and you don't have to do it all, and you certainly don't have to do it immediately as well. All right, so again, and I know that Carrie set up the sort of the ways to reach out, and I would say if you have a question, just sort of throw it out there. I now am teaching online all my classes, as Brian, I saw Brian's up there as well. Brian probably has this experience as well. And I know that it gets a little clunky and weird sometimes, but if you say, I have a question twice, I'm sure I'll hear you and stop and we'll take it from there. So the resource is the Sustainable Development Code. It can be found at sustainablecitycode.org, sustainablecitycode.org. It's up here at the top of your screen. What it is working with planners, architects, lawyers, economists, biologists, and city staff from around the country, we are identifying areas where we can increase sustainability throughout the development code and the development process. So we look at the development code and the development process from soup to nuts and look to see where we can make it better. What is it? Where are the sort of unintended consequences, and how can we address those things? As I mentioned, this is an interdisciplinary project, and as Pat mentioned, her office has been fantastic with supporting this project. We also get support from other folks from around the country on this. We have a whole host of academics and experts and practitioners working on it. We have an extensive and thorough editorial process for things to get up on the website as well. So I'm going to start, though, by talking about how to use it. And so really, there's two ways to access the materials. The first is simply to do a word search. So if you go on the homepage, here I typed in drought, and then you can search the word drought. I'll come back to that one in a moment. The website launched on May 15th of last year. So we've been in operation for about 10 months. What we've been finding over those 10 months is that most people are accessing the information through the button down on the lower left. Not sure where to begin, start here. Now what that does is that opens up a menu, and I'm going to kind of just open up what that looks like. It is really this, so what we did here is we identified 32 areas within the development code and the development code process that implicate sustainability. It's a different way to look at the development code, right? It's saying, look, we as a community, we're interested in climate change. So let's go into the climate change chapter. So this is really a menu for local governments to come to and say, as you can see at the top of the screen, what's challenging your community. So I'm going to walk through the 32 chapters kind of quickly, but we can talk about them more later. Chapter 1 is all sorts of core environmental issues. So climate change, low impact development, and stormwater management. Those are the two chapters we'll go into tonight. Chapter 3 is about wildlife. Chapter 4 and 5 about water, water quality, the conservation. 6 is waste, and then 1.7 urban forestry and vegetation. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of overlap with some of these. So when we put a recommendation, let's say in low impact development and stormwater management, like tree canopy cover that we'll talk about later, it also finds its way into 1.7 urban forestry and vegetation. And so we cross-list these things because sustainability really is a fully integrated process. So chapter 1, environmental issues. Chapter 2 is all about resiliency. So we identified floodplain issues, wildfire, coastal hazards, steep slope, and hazard mitigation resilience. Chapter 3, those of you who work with the development codes a lot, Chapter 3 is more of the core and central development issues that we see. So we have infill, development densities, mixed use, transit-oriented development, and then the two at the top of your screen, historic preservation and parking. Chapter 4 is all about mobility. So again, a different way to think about the development code process. Let's talk about how we can increase development. We'll talk a little bit about this tonight. So we have 4.1, complete streets, safe streets. 4.2, bicycle mobility. 4.3, pedestrian mobility. That's the one I'll talk a little bit about tonight. 4.4, transit. And then finally, autonomous vehicles and electric vehicles. Chapters 5 and 6 are really about social sustainability issues. So we have housing affordability and housing diversity. And then chapter 6, community health and safety. And 6.2, food security and sovereignty. Chapter 7 is all about energy. So we have wind energy, solar energy, other energy generation systems, district energy systems, and energy conservation and efficiency. So the code breaks down into these 32 chapters. For each chapter, we then provide between 25 and 40 recommendations on that specific issue. So we have about, when the code is finally built out, we'll have about 1,100 total recommendations across the code. Right now, we have about 450 built out across the code. And over the next 2 years, the full code will be built out. And then every year we'll update 10 chapters a year. So it'll be on a 3-year revolving cycle. But let's go into one of the chapters now to see what they look like. I'm going to go into chapter 1.2, which is the low impact development chapter. All the chapters, once you go in them, have the same framework. This is what, so we've opened up here, chapter 1.2, low impact development, stormwater management. As I said, all the chapters have the same basic framework. They start with, on the left, remove code barriers. So the idea here is that what in your existing code is stopping you or making or exacerbating stormwater management in chapter 1.2? What is exacerbating stormwater management challenges? How do we address those issues? So removing code barriers. This middle column there, create incentives. So how can we incentivize homeowners and developers to take a variety of actions to address stormwater management? And then finally, fill regulatory gaps. If create incentives is the carrot, fill regulatory gaps we might think of as the stick. What will we draw as an absolute minimum as a community for what we require from homeowners and developers? So again, we have here about, I'd say about 30 recommendations or so in the low impact development chapter. And again, we have about 1,100 across the code. Well, for each recommendation, we then provide what's called a brief. I'm going to go into the brief as an example to show you what they all look like. But this brief we're going to go into is mitigation of lost critical habitats. These briefs were, again, designed with city staff from across the country in an iterative process, trying to identify what was the most important information local staff and local council need to get as quickly as possible to understand this particular recommendation and then potentially adopt it and the information they need to do so. So all of the recommendations have the same structure as well. They start with an introduction. So you can see here that we're in the low impact development. This is mitigation of lost critical habitats. They start with an introduction. And what's important here is that the introduction is not so much what are critical habitats. It's a little bit about that, but not really. What it's really about is what does an ordinance look like that is integrating the mitigation of lost critical habitats into the development code. And so in these two chapters here in the introduction, we're really describing what you can expect to see out there, meaning what have other local governments already done. We're kind of synthesizing that information. We'll get to the case studies in a moment, but here we're just kind of saying, what are the different levers that you can pull as a local government when you're looking at an issue like this? Second, we have effects. What can we expect as a community if we adopt this particular ordinance? After effects, we have really where the rubber meets the road. As many of you know who work with local governments, no local government really likes to be the first to do anything, right? Unless you're like Austin, Boston, Seattle, Portland, this kind of thing, New York City maybe, San Francisco. And so what we're doing here is we're scouring local ordinances from across the country to see who has done this already. We are really trying with these ordinances, we provide 2 to 4 examples. Here we have 2, and we describe them in plain language, what those ordinances are doing. Now, these are adopted ordinances. These are not, let's say, policies or comprehensive plans. These are past enacted ordinances and laws. But what we try to do with these examples is find examples that are sort of pushing the envelope, but also that aren't from the usual cast of characters, right? They're not from the San Franciscos and the New York cities, right? Rather, we're looking for a diversity in jurisdiction and a diversity in size. Here, I've highlighted Snowmass Village, Colorado, only because I'm going to come back to that in just a moment. But so we have 2 to 4 examples that we describe in plain language. This is what you can expect if you look in this ordinance. And you can see we provide links and citations to all the ordinances. And again, I'll come back to those links in just a second. Because in addition to providing examples, we provide what we call additional examples. So additional examples, we provide 4 to 6 of them. We just have the citation for the link, for the code provision, and then we provide a parenthetical. So here it says, prohibiting development in designated areas unless the developer offsets the impact of the habitat by permanently preserving a greater amount of land. The idea is just to give folks a picture of, oh, okay, who else is doing this and where else can I look to find them? And then, of course, we have citations for everything. So what I wanted to show you with the links, and I highlighted that Snowmass Village one, was that our links actually don't go to the local government's website. We actually we capture these we go to their website, but we pull their website into a third-party PermaCC capture. What that means is we have this now permanently. It resides now on a separate website, so the links will never be dead. And we did it partially to make sure that the links never died. But more importantly, what we found through all these conversations was that local governments are not so much concerned with the fact that Snowmass Village passed this law, but really they want to know what's in the law. They want the language, right? And so we can look at this language now, and we've captured it. And of course, if we know that Snowmass Village altered their language, we would change it. But the point being, now we want to make sure we have it and we can provide it to local governments. That is one way in which I mentioned the code, folks get into the code. Very quickly, I'll just show you the second way, and that is through a word search. A word search here, like drought is what I put in. This is searching all of the briefs. And so if I search for drought, it will pull up here all the briefs that have the word drought in it. And I just took a screen capture of what you get. Of some of them, there's more. But here, recycled water irrigation systems for new developments, water efficient landscaping, water wasting activities. You can then click on these and it will take you directly to that brief. Okay, so maybe I'll just pause for a second. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to dive into the green infrastructure chapter. But before I do that, maybe I'll just check to see if there's any general questions on navigating the website. I think you'll get more of the feel for that as we go into these chapters here. You'll see just how much there is in there. But it might be good to just pause for a second to see if there's any questions about getting around the website and that kind of thing. Okay. All right. Certainly, if you have them and if they come up afterwards, definitely feel free to ask. So what I've done here is I've categorized the green infrastructures, the low impact development, stormwater management, chapter 1.2, into really 4 different categories. There's really 4 ways to think about some of the ordinances that are in there. And sometimes if you just look at the recommendations, it gets a little overwhelming. And so I've tried to kind of make it a little bit more digestible, but as you'll see, it's still a ton of information. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is protecting existing green space. So the green space that you already have in Urbandale or Indianola or Des Moines, how do we protect that? The second one, growing green space. How can we expand upon and really grow the stuff that we have, because we know that this kind of stuff can help not only with green infrastructure, but with both mitigating greenhouse gases and adapting to climate change. The third way that I'm going to look at is water capture, and then finally, water wasting activities. So let's start with protecting existing green space. And there's kind of 2 ways in which we're seeing local governments address protecting green space. One is by area, which I'm going to talk about now, and then the next slide we'll look at it by planting. So by area, there's at least 5 different ways. I mean, there's a ton of different ways to do this, but we're seeing at least 5 different interesting ways in which local governments are protecting their green space by area. One is setbacks, protecting sensitive habitats, and water quality. So what I've done here is I've just grabbed one of the ordinances that were on in this particular area. This one happens to be from Fort Collins, Colorado. Specific limitations on any development within 500 feet. Another one, parking maximums. We're all familiar with parking maximums. Hartford, Connecticut actually eliminated minimums altogether in most jurisdictions. Vegetation and protection areas. So we're seeing this in at least 3 different ways. One is to protect vegetation areas by natural areas. So identifying, such as in Wayland, Michigan here, 2 vegetation zones near riparian areas. And they say, we're just going to protect that, and these are the protections we put in place there. Or we can think of it by species. So Thurston County, Washington is identifying specific species that they want to protect. And then a particularly interesting one that I found was in Shasta Lake, California, and this was floating zones. So what this jurisdiction did is it drafted up a pretty strong vegetation protection area and just left it in the code and then said, okay, whenever it identifies particular areas, it can then place it down. Another way to think about protecting green space, the existing green space, is cluster conservation subdivisions in rural urban areas. And there's 2 ways to do this as well. Let me pause for a moment. There are many ways to do all of these things, right? Just some of the stuff that we're seeing in the code. But by doing it by percentage of lot is one way. So 75 to 85% of the lot must remain open. And then the rest of it, you can cluster a number of, and increase diversity on a number of units. Another is to do it by unit. So Amherst, Massachusetts, for every dwelling unit, there must be 2,000 square feet of unusable common land. I'm sorry, usable common land. Finally, purchase of development rights. And these are where we identify protected area and we kind of buy back some rights and transfer them over there. Another way is transfer development rights which requires 2 different lots as opposed to the local government just buying in. So protecting green space by area is one way. We can also, though, protect green space by plantings. And so we have water efficient landscaping. So here, these are jurisdictions that are mostly in drought conditions that are looking at what kind of plantings should we allow here and what do we want here. But this is also true in terms of flooding, right? Looking at native vegetation, and we'll get to that one in just a second. But removal of exotic vegetation. And so a number of ways to do this as well. Require removal of listing exotic plants prior to development. This is out of Collier County, Florida. And then also Walworth County, Wisconsin. Require removing of selective invasive species within 35 feet of wetlands and replacing with native plant species. The idea is to help the native species grow in a way in which hopefully they'll be the ones that will be absorbing some of the flooding conditions and some of the water runoff. The third one down here, planting native vegetation, is really the same side of the opposite side of the same coin as exotic vegetation. So a number of ways to do this as well. We have minimums requiring 75% of vegetation be native in certain zones. Another way is doing it by permits. So requiring a permit before removing any protected native plant species or face a fine. So again, a couple different ways to think about increasing or protecting existing native vegetation. And then finally, native trees and removal of invasive species, invasive trees. Similar to the ones we just talked about, instead though of being shrubs or bushes, these are about trees. So we are protecting our existing green space. Another way to think about this though is to grow the green space. And these are, you might think of as being almost more proactive in the sense that they're trying to actually grow out, taking an assessment of what we have and then growing it out. So tree canopy cover, we have a number of different ways to increase the tree canopy cover here. One is to increase the mitigation requirements. Every local government across the country more or less has some type of tree mitigation ordinance. It's often 1-to-1 or 1-to-2, and it's diameter, breast height, and you can kind of join a bunch together to get there. There's a number of ways to do it, but some ordinances are going well beyond that, right? So requiring developers to plant 10 protected trees for each protected tree removed during development. Again, looking to afforest, looking to increase the tree canopy cover. Baltimore, Maryland has an interesting one too. They actually have afforestation requirements. And what these are is that if you're, this was particularly relevant for commercial properties. If you're a commercial property and you're looking to develop, you come to the site and let's say the site has 8% canopy cover. The code actually requires the site to have 15 to 20%. It actually requires the developer to plant trees to get it to that higher level. So again, afforestation requirements. Others include open space impact fees. Many of you are familiar with these. Green roofing requirements, similar. And finally, minimum pervious cover areas and incentives. So a couple different ways to do this. Fairway, Kansas, setting mandatory permeable surface minimums for new development. And in Georgia, we have requiring new residential driveways and replacing of more than 50% of existing driveways be constructed of permeable materials designed to allow retention. One of the reasons why I like the Tybee Island one is that it doesn't just allow in place, right? So many of these ordinances that we see are often requiring things of new development, but we can think of other ways to require things, including upon renovations, upon sale, upon fire, a bunch of different ways to think about incorporating these over time. Because in fact, we have a solar ordinance on the code, and I was calling, there was a really progressive one out of Lancaster, California, and I contacted the planning department there just to ask him how it's going. It's been in effect for maybe about 2 or 3 years. And it's essentially a net zero requirement. We'll actually see that brief in a bit. But what the planning director said is that it's slow going because there's only so many units that are built, and those are the ones that have to be net zero, but all the others in the jurisdiction don't. So we talked about that for a little bit. Another way to think about low impact development and stormwater management is water capture. A couple different ways to think about this. First is rain harvesting. We'll see another one in just a moment. So limiting homeowners association provisions. We found a number of local government ordinances that are prohibiting homeowners associations from restricting either rain barrels or other kinds of solar collectors, other things, but really rain harvesting systems. These larger systems is really what we're talking about here. And then requiring implementation. So again, a number of jurisdictions are saying, requiring rain harvesting system for all new residential and all new renovated non-residential development. In addition to rain harvesting, we also have rain capture and reuse, water recycling. So recycling water irrigation systems for new developments are some things that are happening out there. Austin, Texas, requiring new commercial development or redevelopments within 250 feet of a reclaimed water main to connect for irrigation, cooling, and other significant non-potable water uses. Another is around car washes. Seeing these across the country where they're requiring car washes to install water recycling systems, again, upon new or renovations. I think we even saw one that was requiring it by a certain date as well. Finally, in this chapter, and again, there's a lot more in this chapter as well, but the other one I pulled up was water wasting activities. And so here in Weatherford, we have, it's a misdemeanor to allow water to flow into any street, road, or highway. Misdemeanor, it's pretty significant for misdirecting some water. Fines and ultimate termination of water services for wasteful water activities, including escape of water through leaks, breaks, irrigation, which causes excessive runoff. Again, pretty significant remedy there, getting rid of someone's water. Then very similar in Laredo as well. So that's a kind of breeze through the low impact development, the low impact development chapter. What I'd like to do now is do a very similar thing looking at the climate mitigation chapter. Climate change is affected in many of the chapters that we talk about. We have a whole bunch of resiliency chapters. This chapter that I'm going to go into is really only about climate mitigation, so the reduction of greenhouse gases as opposed to adaptation. Although, like many things in climate change, things that are directed at mitigation are often helping with adaptation as well, and we'll see that particularly with the increasing sinks. This one I also broke down into 4 different primary issues. The first is increasing renewable energy production. So I'm going to highlight some issues in the code, recommendations in the code that are specifically focused on increasing renewable energy production. Then the second thing, increasing efficiency, reduction in energy demand, and we'll highlight some of those in the code as well. Third, increasing sinks through climate mitigation. And then fourth, which is really just a couple in the code, is maintaining systems. This is really protecting these kind of renewable energy systems once we have them in place. So the first, increasing renewable energy production. What you see hopefully on your screen now is about 40 recommendations that come out of the climate change chapter 1.1. Again, a ton of recommendations here, just trying to break it down a little bit. But all the ones that now have an arrow next to them are about increasing renewable energy. And so you can see that they're directly dealing with things that are in the development code. So things like, I don't know if you can see my cursor off on the left here, but height and setbacks to encourage renewables. This is in the better remove code barrier. Going up one, solar energy systems and wind turbines by right. So these are the kind of things that you will find in this section pertaining specifically to renewable energy production. I mentioned this one over here on the fill regulatory gaps, best, the last one, zero net energy buildings. In addition to these, and again, like all of these, you can go into the specific recommendations, and there's a ton of information in there, again, with all of our examples and additional examples. So increase renewable energy production. And then we also have increasing efficiency. So some of the ones that are kind of straightforward that I like to talk about are the ones down here in the lower left, remove code barriers and good. I think these are all ones that most people know about, but continue to really, local governments continue to struggle with trying to figure out how to do and stuff. But allowing for accessory dwelling units, allowing for live work units, mixed use zoning, tiny homes and compact living spaces. Some of the others, though, that are sort of more sort of really investigating what is in the development code and in the development process. In the fill regulatory gaps column and the better, this one here, maximum size of single family residence. it's a really interesting brief. What's happening here is local governments have identified buildings or houses specifically that have particularly high ceilings. So in many of these jurisdictions, if you have a ceiling over, let's say, 12 or 14 feet, it counts double towards the floor area ratio, which would then limit the amount of square area you can have in the house. The idea is to try to reduce the amount of energy demand we're having in particular houses. Some other interesting ones, the top one in the fill regulatory gaps, alternative pedestrian routes to parking areas, neighborhoods, and businesses. The idea here is to increase pedestrian mobility. And I'll just talk about that briefly in just a moment. Not that particular recommendation, but pedestrian mobility. The next one is increasing sinks. So in addition to reducing demand and increasing production of renewable energies, we also want to think about increasing sinks. And so here we see many of the things that we already talked about, increasing the tree canopy cover. We didn't talk about require energy efficiency landscaping, or maybe we did a little bit. Vegetation protection areas, green zones, green roofing. So all of the things you would sort of expect in ways that we've already talked about to grow the vegetation in the area, to increase the, or reduce greenhouse gas emissions, increase the sinking potential. Finally, maintaining systems. And what you see here are things like limiting off-property shading of solar energy systems. We also have a dispute resolution ordinance that is up on the website. It didn't make it into this version of it just went up on the website, and right before I think I screen captured this, it went up afterwards. So there's another one though on there that deals with dispute resolution among neighbors, trying to how to resolve those solar shading issues. So that's a kind of quick breeze through the climate change chapter. I want to highlight just a couple other chapters that I think are really relevant and important when we're thinking about the reduction of greenhouse gases. The first I mentioned briefly is the pedestrian mobility chapter. So up here, you can see about 25 or so recommendations. These are all about increasing pedestrian mobility. So increasing mid-block pedestrian crossings over here on the right. Public art requirements, getting people out, getting them moving through. We talked about alternative pedestrian routes to parking areas, neighborhoods, and businesses. We have up here on here things that address drive-throughs, things that address garages, lighting. There's all sorts of different ways, parklets, different ways in which we can think about increasing pedestrian mobility. And again, I think that when we start to think about a long-term, systemic, strategic plan for reducing greenhouse gases, pedestrian mobility is a great way to begin to think about these, particularly in a place like Urbandale, which has all these really interesting places to move about. Another one to think about is the energy chapter generally. So in the energy chapter, we have wind energy, solar energy, and the three others, district energy and generation systems, and energy efficiency. In particular, the solar energy system, the solar energy chapter is built out already. The wind energy is not. It's not built out yet. We're working on that one. I think it's slated for winter of 2020, 2021. So about another year from now, the wind energy should be up and running. But the solar energy one is up and running already. And so probably good to kind of poke around that one and see what's in there. Now, those are all climate mitigation. I just want to end with one other, and that's just, again, to look at chapter 2 when we start to think about resiliency. Particularly things in the floodplain and river corridor land use might be relevant to Urbandale. I believe that's it. Yeah, that sums up my my presentation. I hope you have found it helpful, and I am more than glad again to take any comments or questions now. My information is right here on the screen, and I know that Linda and Carrie and Pat all have it, and so if you don't have a chance to jot it down now, you can certainly get it from them. I'm glad to field any questions. Thanks.
So I have unmuted everybody, but if you've muted yourself, you'll have to take yourself off mute to be able to speak. So now I guess if people want to go ahead, you don't have to type in the chat, just jump in.
I've got a question that I probably just wasn't quite tracking, but when you went through the chapter before the last one and you had all the arrows, and it was these different strategic approaches, like increasing things. Is that, were those all increasing? I didn't quite track whether that was a master list of recommendations and you were saying here with the arrows are the ones that are about increasing sinks, or if increasing sinks shows up all by itself. You with me?
Yes, right. No, so yeah, these are, it does not. So Ben, thanks for that, Pat. So when you go to the code and you go into chapter 1.1, it will look like this. It won't have any arrows on it. It will have the 3 columns: remove code barriers, create incentives, fill regulatory gaps. It's overwhelming already. And so what I tried to do is just try to break it down a little bit. And I know it's still not, I mean, it's still, there's a ton of information. So what I was doing here was just highlighting the ones that address sinks only.
That's what I thought you were doing, but I just wanted to check. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
It's both still super helpful, and thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you.
Jonathan, this is Linda. I know that you also wrote a book. So can you tell us how your book compares to the website?
Sure, yes. So the book was really in many ways based on what you find on the website. It was another way to kind of get this information out there. There's a couple things that we added in the book. The big one being that we did this kind of recategorization that you see up here. And so there is an appendix in the book that has this increased sinks, and then it lists all the ones that are specifically for sinks, and then it gives the page number in the book where you can find it. You know, again, we were just, the stuff on the website is free, but we really wanted to make sure that people were getting it. So the book, and I get like literally like a penny on each book, so I'm not trying to sell the book, but it's $12.95. And so the idea was to get it out to as many folks as possible, and really just try to get this information out there.
What is the book, Jonathan?
Let me see if I can quickly. Yeah, I'll stop sharing for a second and then I'll come back, see if I can quickly get it up here for you.
This is Carolyn. I have a question. Do many of these city ordinances, I noticed like Fort Collins and Tucson, do they have climate action plans already in order? You know, have they already passed climate action plans?
Yes, that is a great question. Yes, so some of them have, some haven't, and I think we're all over the map with some of the stuff where you have some have done GHG inventories, some have done climate plans, some have done resiliency plans, some have done all 3, and you know, then you also have I don't want to dive down into this rabbit hole too much. But then you have both some that have done GHG inventories based on sector, and then you have a handful that have done GHG inventories based on consumption. And they give you different pieces of information. I mean, the consumption-based ones are more expensive. They're more involved. There's a ton of information that's required to put those together. But they also yield really fascinating and helpful information, I think.
And then a second to follow up, do you think that the cities that have the really good climate action plans really could bring in the ordinances much quicker?
Oh, that's a tough one, right? I mean, I think that's all also over the map. I mean, all over the map. You know, one of the things that we tried to do with the Sustainable Development Code is to avoid any kind of hurdle based on politics. And so how did we do that? Well, the first thing we did is we said, well, look, we're not telling you to go into any chapter. We have 32 chapters listed here. You tell us what's challenging your community. And I feel really confident that it doesn't matter where on the political spectrum a particular jurisdiction may find itself, there is some chapter that's relevant to them. That's one. The second thing we tried to do is say, well, if that's the issue that you're concerned with, let's remove the barriers that are in your existing code, right? This is sort of the idea that, yes, for us, flooding is an issue. Okay, well, let's go into the flooding chapter and let's talk about that. Let's look at the remove code barriers. What in your existing code is making it worse? And that's the kind of conversation that is very easy to have. And then the final way is through this sort of peer-to-peer pressure, right? But you know, there's 39,000 local governments, not including the special district stuff, but 39,000 that have some jurisdiction to govern land use, and they're really just all over the map with this question of can we get climate done?
So this is a follow-up in a way. I'm curious, you know, for a citizen group like this one, like how does somebody think about using the website, using these examples from around the country to work with a local government like Urbandale? Like, you go through every chapter? Do you think about, you know, doing a kind of comprehensive approach or targeting one area? I'm just curious how you're seeing people use the website effectively.
Yeah, so, you know, it's been great to see because similar to the last question, there's different ways in which people are accessing the information and utilizing it efficiently. So one of the ways, which is really the most straightforward, is we know we want to do X. We want to put in vegetation protection areas. They'll go to the website and they'll get the information they need. Very straightforward, right? Not the sort of typical one, but that's one way. Another way is we know our issue. So we know we want to reduce greenhouse gases. And so someone or a group of folks will actually go through the recommendations first. So it doesn't take a whole lot of time to go through the recommendations themselves because they're only about 6 or 7 words for each recommendation. I'm not talking about the briefs. I'm just talking about the grid portion. And just go through that and say, well, let's talk about what percolates to the surface here, if anything, right? Another way is that I've worked actually with local governments already in doing workshops. Pat has done these workshops a gazillion times, right? And so we've workshopped around a particular issue, and not so much tapping directly into the code as the driver, but looking at the local government and the local community and saying, okay, what do we really want to take on and how are we going to do that, and sort of build it up from the bottom up. And then the last way is that we've had a number of folks just come in and say, you know what, we're actually really interested in this specific issue and this specific brief. Can you just draft us the language based on the code that we have, write us the language for it. And that's mostly in jurisdictions that I've seen a little bit smaller than Urbandale. Urbandale is what, about 45, 50,000 people? Is that right? Isn't that wrong?
Yeah, might be.
Yeah, yeah, quite a bit smaller than that. I think the largest one that I've done that with has been about 24,000, and the smallest has been 350. Worked with Bluff, Utah. Still working with Bluff, Utah, which is just a small jurisdiction. So, Brian, to answer your question, I think there's a lot of ways, but I think, you know, if you know the issue, one way would be for a handful of folks to start to say, all right, let's just sit down with the recommendations and kind of circle maybe the 10, you know, you can start big, 10 or 12 that we want to look at first, and then go into those briefs, and then spend a couple moments on each of those briefs and kind of work through them that way.
Does the website have resources on these kinds of planning processes? Or is that something, you know, we do independently and then come to this resource?
That's a great, Pat, thanks for that. No, we don't. We should, though. You know, we should. I've done a lot of these kind of just, this is what the code consists of and how to move through it. But we don't have a step-by-step guide for really how to use it. It'd be an interesting project, though, and I think an important one to get out there. I think, again, there's a lot of ways to use it, but I think it would be helpful to give at least some recommendations and some drive.
We'll document what we do.
Yes, please do.
One last quick question. Aside from the good, better, best, which implies impact, I would assume on the basis, but of the bests, is there something in the briefs that helps us kind of sort through what's the best of the best, where we are most likely to get our best impact, where we should put our eggs?
Also a great question. So first, you know, I should tell you that the good, better, and best, that came out of, again, an iterative process. So what we try with each of these chapters is to have at least 3 primary editors. And they are an academic, a practitioner, and then at least one other, and then I'm an editor for all of these as well. But I'm usually at the very end. Depends on the chapter. If it's something like climate change, I was one of the three. But most of them, it's not my area of expertise. And so those three folks, though, get together and they figure out, okay, what based on the impact should be the most relevant and the most impactful. But you can imagine that it's wholly dependent upon the geography, the culture, the economy, the traditions in the jurisdiction. So there's going to be all sorts of variables that are going to alter the impact. So we don't have anything directly in there, although we do have for each recommendation that effects section that should walk through what we can expect as a jurisdiction if we do this. And those are all cited pretty heavily. So the secondary, the sources that are cited in there should also give you a good background.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So very quickly, see if I can find this, if I can share again. I'm not sure. Maybe not. So here's the, this is actually at West Academic, who's not the actual publisher for it, but here it's 971, and this is the book, Remarkable Cities in the Fight Against Climate Change, 43 Recommendations to Reduce Greenhouse Gases in the Communities that Adopt Them.
And I can send out a link as well to everybody with the copy of the recording, or a link to the recording also.
Thank you. Thanks, Carrie.
Other questions that people have?
I just, as I'm thinking about this, of course, here in Des Moines, we've worked several years trying to get the approval of a sustainability coordinator in a sustainability department in Des Moines, as well as a climate action plan. And we've already done a greenhouse gas inventory. But I really wonder if having a sustainability coordinator who would coordinate all the departments in the city in climate mitigation would really be an advantage, as well as a climate action plan allowing for a guide for us citizens trying to figure this out and work with the city. I don't know. I just, those are just thoughts that are in my head right now.
I mean, I think, and Pat can speak to this more than I can, but I think just as a matter of good planning, it would be, it would behoove a jurisdiction, I think, to think broadly about these things. I mean, I don't think there's any question that any one of us right now could say, all right, we definitely need this narrow thing, so let's do that. But at the same time, let's think broader scale and let's get together a climate action plan. And of course, like anything, resources is a cost. But if one had the resources to have someone dedicated to issues relevant to sustainability or a climate overseer, that would certainly expedite the process as well. I don't think there's any question about that. It doesn't guarantee the political aspects of this,
Right.
but it certainly, it helps facilitate get the ball rolling and doing the background work. I mean, that was one of the things, like this website was really designed to assist all of those jurisdictions who, and I lived in Des Moines for 10 years and I love Des Moines, right? But for all those cities that aren't 210,000, that don't have the ability to have Laura Graham, who unfortunately moves away also, but have a sustainability director, right? Or have someone who has the resources to go to put into climate. It's really about those jurisdictions that are like sort of Urbandale, 100,000 people and under. That's, I think, where we're finding most of the need for the resources. So, go ahead, Pat.
Well, I just wanted to mention that the mayor and Councilwoman Bridget Montgomery. We're both kind of planning on joining us. Mayor did get it done, but had to peel off because something came up. But they intend to watch this later. So with that in mind, I would love for you, perhaps, Jonathan, and we realize this is just, we haven't prepared you for this, but can you give us kind of strategic recommendations from the top of your head? And there's two prongs here. One is the organization of this group. We don't really exist yet. We're just in the process of forming. So if we were to form some kind of sustainability team, to what extent should it be a partnership with the city? To what extent might it be better as an independent citizens group? What thoughts do you have there? And then you mentioned climate action plan, and thanks, Carolyn, for bringing that up. If you were to think about maybe some next steps for us once we sort of figure out our structure, what would be some of those recommendations from you about directions we might head?
Yeah, great. Well, first of all, again, I commend you all for doing this. This is such great and important work, both in terms of the stormwater management stuff and the greenhouse gas stuff. So I think, and this is based on anecdotal information and my personal experience with a number of these communities throughout the country, is that we're often finding that the citizen groups are fantastic and they are ready to get things done and they move things quickly at the front end. But the back end stuff is where we typically are having some challenges. And so those other groups, the ones that are citizen groups, but also are integrated into the city. So for example, having the mayor and the councilwoman or the councilwoman on the committee is, I think, a huge help, right? Because if we can get their buy-in at the outset, and I don't think I'm telling particularly you, Pat, anything new here. You probably know this as well as anyone in the country, right? How to get these things done. So I think that setting this up, I think, is a huge, important step, and to think about who should be on it. At the same time, you don't want it hijacked by someone, which I've seen as well in different contexts. And so, a word of caution on that. And what I mean by that, I guess, mostly in this context is, and I'm not trying to offend anyone here, but like anyone who's a climate denier, you probably don't want on the committee. It won't facilitate the discussion. And right, I mean, it's one thing to talk about, should we do this policy or not do that policy? That's the conversation you want to have, right? You don't want to have the conversation, are we having an impact on the climate, right? That's not a fruitful conversation. So that's just a word of caution on that. On the recommendations, you're probably not talking to the right person, because I am someone who is just go for it, right? I mean, I am really of the idea that by the time we figure out what we want to do and we're comfortable with what we want to do, it's essentially passé, or we need to go to the next step. So I would say shoot big, right? Whether you're looking at, if you go with sinks, you're thinking not just to maintain those sinks, but to really grow those sinks, right? How can we make sure that we are removing some of our large parking lots, for example, and proactively getting in some more vegetation to help that stormwater management, but also help greenhouse gas mitigation. Likewise with buildings, right? I think these zero net energy buildings ordinances out there are really the way of the future, right? I mean, if we really want to get this stuff done, we have to tell the developers as they're building them, you got to we also have a site, I don't know if you all saw it, but there was a site orientation recommendation as well, which just said, if you're going to build a building, you need to make sure it maximizes solar exposure. So you don't have to put it in here, right? This is sort of a step back from zero net energy buildings. So that's an example. But then also the zero net energy building stuff is just basically saying, you need to achieve zero net energy however you want to do it. If you want to make it passive, lock it down and then have a small system, you can do that. If you want to build a regular construction and then have a massive system, you can do that. But I think that's sort of the only way that we're really going to achieve any kind of true mitigation here. Again, this question is a dangerous one, right? Because we're talking now about not Urbandale, right? We're talking about what do we need as a country, essentially. Whereas what we need in Urbandale takes a very different look, and that is about like what are you looking at in Urbandale, right? Are we looking at moving out into the annexed areas that go up into the northwest or whatever it is? What should that look like? Those are the kind of questions that you probably want to ask at the front end.
That was helpful. Thank you. I'm going to shut up and hit my mute button and let other people ask questions.
Well, so I don't know if I can do this, but I'd love to hear though what you all are thinking in terms of, what are the pressing challenges and where let's take the climate question, where in the climate arena, in terms of local government actions, would you want to see the local government take on? Okay. Sorry.
Oh, no, I was going to say, Pat or Linda, do either one of you guys want to talk about that in terms of Urbandale? Or, I mean, we have not talked about it a lot yet. We're just starting it.
I want to hear from others.
This is Marianne. After I looked at your website just very briefly before this meeting, and now with your giving us a little bit more, giving us quite a bit more information about it. I think for myself, I would like to go, and I'd like to see us as a group to go back and look at it and see what really does interest us. When you were talking about, I get my notes here, I've written some things down, growing the green spaces, that can involve the flood mitigation, as we've talked about a little in our group, but also it sparks my interest more than mitigating floods, which is also very important, but they overlap. They're not exclusive of each other. So I think just taking time to go back and look through your website and see what really, what each of us that are going to kind of pursue and go on with this, to see what interests us might be a way to use what you have done, and then to go forward as a group and give us a little bit more talking ground when we do get together.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Suggestion, whatever.
That's great.
What do others think?
I will just add, I'm just pleased we got together and are having this conversation to start. I think it will be organic, but the fact that we're talking with each other empowers us as a group, and I learned from this. I have a lot to learn about codes. I have a lot to learn about the details of what really helps with climate mitigation. I think I often think about this as to how we would change our relationship with the earth and what we would do differently, but that takes a big cultural change. That may be at a different angle than dealing with the details. So I really appreciate everyone else helping me learn these, because I have a lot to learn.
I have something I wanted to offer. I was on mute and I didn't know it, but just, I've often thought, I've lived in Urbandale for a long time, I've often wished that we had better pedestrian access to some of the stores and things that are nearby. I could easily walk to Fairway, for instance, but I don't want to stand at that busy intersection waiting to cross. And I know my grandkids and my kids, I know they do the same thing. And, we've got Walgreens, but it's just so darn hard to cross the streets. And so and then also public transportation. I've often wished there were minivans or something. I know we've lived in other towns where there was small vans that you could get around locally easier than having to use your car, especially when you've got older populations that shouldn't be driving. So those are some things that appeal to me anyway.
That's great, Betsy. I gotta tell you, I think the pedestrian mobility chapter and the things that governments are doing on pedestrian mobility is fascinating, and it's so important, and it's helpful not only to reduce greenhouse gases through the transportation, but it's so good for the health of the community, right? I mean, not only are people exercising, but they're getting out. They're seeing each other, they're talking. I mean, right now, we're not seeing each other and we're talking, but in a better time, we will again. And I think it's really important to do those things.
Yeah, we see a lot of people walking on the trails now, people that we never see. We live on a trail, and that's great, but I think a lot of those people would have a destination. If they could walk up to one of the nearby stores or something, that's kind of more fun for teenagers than just walking on the trail.
Yeah, yeah.
Other thoughts or comments?
Jonathan, I just really want to express my gratitude for you doing this. I think one of the things the website does is really give an overall kind of view of what a good sustainability, all the different aspects of it that we could look at. So thank you so much for your work, and thank you so much for meeting with us and presenting to us.
It is my pleasure. I want to just throw out one other thing for you all. So keep in mind that the code is very much focused only on development and the development code and zoning and that kind of thing. There are other opportunities for you to explore with these as well. In the past, I've done a lot of work with procurement codes. So procurement for both the local government and the school district. Those are really good ways to think about reducing greenhouse gases as well. But there are things that reside outside of the website that are really important to think about as well. And so, those are things that we can talk about as well if you're interested. But those are things that you won't find on the website. But I think that you might want to explore through someone else who's an expert in those areas. And again, thank you. And if you need anything from me, let me know. I encourage you to do this.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
This is wonderful.
My pleasure. Thank you all. Have a great night and stay healthy.